The 1930s were a time when isolationism took hold in the US after World War I. In the 1920s, President Wilson's idealism, called Wilsonianism, was in full bloom. But after participating in World War I, a sense of fatigue took hold of America. You can start to see the American pattern here, right? They engage, then get tired, and then the isolationists, the Jacksonians, rise again. The Jacksonian figure of the 1930s was Senator Nye. He was a Republican senator from North Dakota, and he led what's known as the Nye Committee. The Nye Committee made arguments you're all very familiar with. Bankers and arms manufacturers, in short, the military-industrial complex, dragged the United States into World War I. The Senate committee set up to verify this claim was the Nye Committee. It operated from 1934 to 1936 and published its findings. In that report, they argued that financiers pressured President Wilson to enter the war, so their loans to Europe wouldn't go bad, and that American arms manufacturers persuaded the government to join the war. They backed this up with evidence and gained public support. As a result, both the House and Senate passed what became the Neutrality Acts. That was in 1937. It banned the export and import of weapons and other war materials, and also banned loans to belligerent countries. They hammered these restrictions in place. In short, isolationism won. The representative of this isolationism, to put it negatively, he would be like being pro-Japanese or pro-Nazi in our terms. But to put it nicely, he was a non-interventionist, an anti-British advocate. And that was Joseph Kennedy, the father of John F. Kennedy, whom we all know well. He donated heavily to Roosevelt's campaign. He was a wealthy man. So President Roosevelt appointed him as ambassador to the UK. He became ambassador to the UK at the most dramatic moment in history, but he was the last person who should have been in that position, and he did everything he could to block US entry into the war. Eventually, Roosevelt got fed up and fired him. Roosevelt clearly didn't share his view. Anyway, because of this Neutrality Act, Roosevelt's hands were tied, and around the outbreak of the war, Roosevelt pleaded with Congress. This isn't right. We need to come to our senses. Europe's crisis isn't just Europe's problem. We have to help now. Remember how Britain defaulted on its debts after World War I? Not just Britain. All the European powers took advantage of America. Naturally, Americans weren't happy about that. That's why debts should be paid back. It all came to this because the debts weren't paid back. People need to realize America is not Santa Claus. Sure, sometimes the US acts like Santa. You have to make good use of that. To do that, you have to pay your debts. So on the condition that everything be paid in cash, they got approval to export military supplies. So how did they convince Congress to approve this? They said, if they say they'll pay in cash, we'll even sell to Germany. Technically, they were still honoring the spirit of the Neutrality Act. Oh, really? So as long as it's cash up front, that benefits our national interest, right? We're selling goods, okay? And that's how Congress gave its approval. Then the administration cleverly took advantage of the approval. But in reality, they didn't sell to Germany. They only sold military supplies to Britain and its allies. That's how deeply rooted isolationism is in the US, you see? Even after fighting in the Korean War, America quickly reverted to isolationism after just a few months of combat. Same after World War I, straight back to isolationism. World War II was the only real exception. During Vietnam, isolationism teamed up with idealism and things got chaotic. So what about now? It's back to isolationism again. The spirit of isolationism is very strong. Korean leaders need to be very aware of this. Pendulum, the US, swings back and forth like a pendulum, and right now it's swinging powerfully toward isolationism. So even if we criticize the US, it has to be in that context. When America is already heading toward isolationism, if we shout Yankee go home, they really will leave. That's not the context right now. Roosevelt's administration is still at war in Asia and Europe. During the war, the Lend-Lease Act was passed, not just as a workaround to the Neutrality Act, but as a full law. It passed with overwhelming support in both the House and Senate in 1941. In short, isolationism was receding. If you listen to Britain's two main arguments about the Lend-Lease Act, you'll realize, America is always a country that always hears things like this. Have you seen the film Darkest Hour? The Darkest Hour, it's a film about Churchill and World War II. It came out about 4 years ago, around the same time as another World War II movie. Dunkirk. I watched both Dunkirk and Darkest Hour. I'm really into this kind of stuff, so I watched them The movie about the Dunkirk evacuation is quite moving, and after watching it, it kind of makes you fall in love with the British Empire. It's almost like a national enlightenment film. But Darkest Hour, on the other hand, deals with Churchill as a real person. So if I had to recommend one, I'd recommend Darkest Hour. There's a scene where Churchill calls Roosevelt from the bathroom, practically begging him. And Roosevelt says he desperately wants to help, but Congress has his hands tied. Political maneuvering is extremely difficult. You have to go down the list and persuade each member of Congress one by one. What's the issue in your state? I'll build a factory there for you, and so on, securing votes one at a time. Your party doesn't automatically follow you. Yet, in this overwhelmingly isolationist America, the Lend-Lease Act passed. British historian Michael Howard put it this way. In the 1940s, the Americans had some reason to regard the British as a lot of toffee-nosed bastards who oppressed half the world and had a sinister talent for getting other people to do their fighting for them. And Americans vividly remembered how Britain had defaulted on its World War I debt. Yet, despite all that, Congress voted by a wide margin to let the US support Britain in the European war. In other words, thank you. Prime Minister Churchill called it the most altruistic law in human history. He sucked up to it so much, almost embarrassingly. But if you watch Darkest Hour, you'll see just how desperate Britain was. Anyway, because Hitler was a military genius, he crushed continental Europe. France didn't even stand a chance and was utterly destroyed. As for Dunkirk, my view is that, though there are various theories, Hitler hesitated for a day to basically wave a love letter at Britain. If he hadn't held back, Britain might have been wiped out too. The darkest hour, when Western and European civilization was about to be replaced by Nazism. America was still wrestling with isolationism. US isolationism is no joke, it's not to be underestimated. But regarding the Lend-Lease Act, Britain's Tories, the Conservative Party, and they had a rather cynical take on it. To supply Britain with arms in the name of defending democracy. It's something the Yanks just can't resist. Yanks here are referring to Americans. They're a peculiar bunch. They know that if we lose the war, they'll be Hitler's next target. That's why they want us to do the fighting for them. They'll do anything as long as it's not the actual fighting. That's how they put it. Churchill was a Tory. Prime Minister Churchill expressed gratitude, calling it the most altruistic bill. But others in his party, they were like, those damn Yankees just want us to fight for them. That's always how it is with America, right? Isn't this perspective so modern? We Koreans have the same two views, right? One says, thanks for fighting in the Korean War. And the other, Americans this and that, blah, blah. That's America's destiny. We need to think about these things as we study. A narrative is just a narrative. It can help or distort our explanation of reality. That's why we need to see things as they are. As I give you this geopolitics lecture, well made, I feel like I'm delivering a kind of shock to you who have been well made in Korea. If you think imperialism is always bad, then sure, in that world, majority, you might be part of the moral majority in your own way, but you won't gain real insight. And you definitely won't be able to understand the era we live in now. The word imperialism isn't important. What matters lies elsewhere. I made this lecture to open your eyes to that. Is America an angel or a devil? In Korea, we often face these binary arguments. Digital people who only see 0 and 1, right? That kind of thinking dominates our politics and media. Everything's binary with them, just yes or no. We need to get smarter than that. We have to see things as they really are. There was a hidden motive among America's elites behind the Lend-Lease Act. It was to dismantle the British imperial economic bloc. We've forgotten now, but Britain was a formidable empire. They ruled the world for a full century. The Americans saw a chance to take it apart. Even though they were allies, the US was fighting two enemies, totalitarian Nazi Germany and British imperialism. Through World War II, they aimed to dismantle the British Empire as well. Article 7 of the Lend-Lease Act draft, the law Churchill once called the most friendly act in human history. When Roosevelt was trying to pass the act, here's how he pitched it to Congress. If your friend's house is on fire and they ask to borrow your hose, do you say not until you pay me? Is that what a friend does? And Americans were like, yeah, he's got a point. There's a kind of innocence, right? You lend the hose first, then get paid later. That's how he persuaded Congress. But there was a knife hidden in there. The terms and conditions upon which the United Kingdom receives defense aid from the United States of America. And the benefits to be received by the United States of America in return, therefore, as finally determined, shall be such as, not to burden commerce between the two countries, but to promote mutually advantageous economic relations between them and the betterment of worldwide economic relations. They shall provide against discrimination in either the United States of America or the United Kingdom, against the importation of any product originating in the other country, and they shall provide for the formulation of measures for the achievement of these ends. Now, why would this obvious common sense clause be a problem? It might not seem like a problem to us today. But you have to think about it this way. At the time, Britain controlled 25% of the world's land surface. A full quarter of the world was the British bloc. What percent of the world's land surface does the United States currently occupy? Maybe 5%. Britain, controlling 25% of the world's surface, could easily operate a self-sustaining economy within its bloc. In other words, American merchants and businesses were never treated on equal footing in British colonies. They were always second to British companies. So if you read this law and this clause from the perspective of dismantling the British Empire, it makes sense. British lawmakers saw it that way too. In exchange for receiving US defense resources, the benefits the US receives should not burden trade between the two countries, but rather promote mutual economic cooperation and international trade. And preparation must be made to ensure there is no discrimination. The word discrimination was included. The freest possible economic interchange without discriminations, without exchange controls, without economic preference utilized for political purposes, and without all of the manifold economic barriers, which had, in my judgment, been so clearly responsible for the present world collapse. What does this mean? They're demanding the dismantling of the special economic bloc known as the Sterling Bloc. If India is a British colony, India would treat British and American firms differently. But now America wanted India to trade with them on equal terms. So from the British perspective, it was such a pressing issue, and it sparked fierce debate. Should they accept this clause or not? Roosevelt, while presenting himself as a generous grandfather, pushed for the law. But his Secretary of State and Treasury Secretary clung to this clause. They fixated on the word discrimination. And eventually Roosevelt got frustrated and told them to take out the word discrimination, which they did, leaving it ambiguous, and Churchill and Roosevelt struck a dramatic compromise. The point is, these micro-historical details may not matter to you, but the impression you should get is this. As I said before, when Keynes asked, "Why are you treating us so coldly?" America is that kind of country. They believe debts must be paid, no exceptions. What Americans hate most is unpaid debts. If you ask for aid, they'll give it, but debts are a separate matter. Second, America will destroy any country that gets ahead of them, even if they share ancestry, the same language, and the same legal system. If it gets ahead, America will break it when given the chance. You have to see things for what they are. In one sense, it's been the most generous empire or world hegemony in history, but it didn't last that long. Maybe 30 or 40 years tops. Britain was at its wit's end, thinking if only it weren't for those damn Germans, America would be nothing. But because of the Germans, fine, America, take it all, and ended up leasing most of its naval bases in the Western Hemisphere to America. Indefinitely, maybe for 100 years, Britain's naval bases in North and South America. They used to be right off America's coast. They lost all of that. And that's when America's era truly began. It marks the arrival of the American era, or what you could call the post-imperial era, the post-imperial age. Imperialism is no longer tolerated. Even my allies' imperialism isn't tolerated, let alone my enemy's imperialism. Japanese imperialism is not even funny. Get back inside your own territory. That's how it went. If America dismantled the empires of its friends, Britain and France, there's no way it would leave the empires of its enemies, Japan and Germany, intact. They dismantled them all. But why do we need to understand post-imperialism? Because it's the foundation for understanding modern finance. We use the term regime in academia. You've heard it in terms like regime change, right? Sometimes we say governance, but regime is more accurate. Scholars translate regime as the procedures by which something operates. Global finance must have procedures. 3FTX, take FTX, one of the top 3 crypto exchanges, it collapsed. There needed to be some way to handle the fallout, right? Somehow. There were victims and creditors, it needed to be handled, but no such process exists. That's why we're floundering now. In traditional finance, there's a well-defined process for this kind of thing. That's called a regime. So in simple terms, Bitcoin, blockchain, and cryptocurrencies don't have a completed regime yet. Finance is global. You have to understand America's insistence on post-imperialism to understand the global financial regime. You can't understand this just by studying corporate finance or monetary theory. I read in a book by a professor who taught monetary economics at university that he later realized he wasn't teaching finance at all. What he'd really taught was just probability and statistics. He's totally right. You can teach something unreal. That's just how academic disciplines often are. To understand modern finance, you really need to understand America's post-imperial era. That's what today's lecture is about. So what was the goal of the post-1945 financial system? First, governments would have greater influence over the market. Here the keyword is government versus market. Which is bigger? Government. Second, to restrain individual governments from manipulating trade for their own gain. That implies cooperation between governments. So in government versus market, government is superior. And second, governments cooperate. Third, to overcome the problem of gold and dollar shortages. In other words, to escape liquidity constraints in times of crisis. You saw it during COVID, right? When the world hits a crisis like that, watch how governments react. They print money like crazy. That would have been impossible under the gold standard, since it was constrained by the limits of gold. Fourth, to prevent capital from crossing borders chaotically, stopping speculators from manipulating and profiting. Who's the target here? Speculators. Which kind? The big ones. In other words, those who move across borders, manipulate exchange rates, and profit from interest rate differences. Fifth, to encourage collaboration among nations on monetary policy through institutions. The key word here is institution. One key feature of the post-1945 system is the proliferation of global organizations. WTO, WHO, IMF, World Bank, and so on. IMF, did you elect the head of the IMF? Who did you elect the head of WHO? WTO, the WTO director? We learned that it was a democracy, but these regimes that we don't elect govern the people of the world. People, they govern all the people of the world. What is this? Anyway, this is a characteristic of the post-imperial era. Since today, we're studying the global financial regime. Let's control capital flows through international cooperation. Where did this idea come from? From Dexter White, the American who drafted Bretton Woods. He was a pro-Soviet intellectual who was also a spy for the Soviets. White argued that wealthy people trying to avoid taxes and social reforms were a major cause of currency instability and used that to justify capital controls. He said, if the capital isn't for trading actual goods, but just investment, then it violates the spirit of free trade and currency exchange. In White's proposed system, member countries were allowed to block investment-related capital flows. And if a country was receiving such speculative inflows, it had to cooperate with other members to restrict that inflow. It emphasizes cooperation between nations. No single country can stop capital flows on its own. It can only be done through international cooperation, without the consent of the other country's government, without the permission of the other country's government. If a member state makes a formal request, then that country's citizens deposits investments and securities. If there is a request from the government of a particular member country, for example, if a government says, someone from our country seems to have deposited money in your country's bank, show us the records, then they would comply, even if that person isn't a criminal. But in 1944, all references to mandatory international cooperation on capital controls were deleted. It was that strong at first, with the draft giving governments massive power to regulate the market, especially the capital market. But by 1944, the wording changed from mandatory to may cooperate, not mandatory, but permitted. Why the shift? Because it wasn't made alone. There were financiers in America. When White and Keynes drafted a system where governments dominated markets, America's financial elites stepped in behind the scenes. New York bankers, to be specific, they opposed the ideas proposed by White and Keynes. They didn't want to block capital inflows. It would hurt their business. The US back then was already like it is now. America has always been America. So as wealthy people from unstable, ruined Europe moved capital into America, US banks were raking in deposits while doing nothing. Capital controls that would kill the flow. So there were very real business interests involved. There was also the belief that if government power overwhelmed the market, democracy couldn't survive. A liberal democracy, to be exact. In other words, White's thinking is quite different from ours. Almost like he's pro-Soviet. He wasn't a liberal Democrat. To him, the wars in Europe were an ugly fight between so-called democratic states. Back then, even more than today, there was deep skepticism about liberal democracy among intellectuals. That's why so many intellectuals became communists. Philosophically, communism has its roots in Platonism. If you look at it philosophically, Platonism ultimately means that the wise rule the era. Instead of leaving rule to the market or other impersonal systems, it is the sage who governs, and it despises democracy. It was democracy that couldn't recognize how great Socrates was and killed him, right? So Platonism fundamentally hates democracy. And that's the philosophical root of communism. So these ideological clashes arose. If the state becomes too powerful, the real threat isn't just to finance, but to democracy itself. If governments make arbitrary policies, there must be ways to hold those policies accountable. So who enforces discipline? The market does. For example, to suppress domestic inflationary pressures, you need a dollar free from all capital controls. Who said this? Winthrop Aldrich of Chase National Bank. Why is this significant? Because there's no such thing as a dollar free from arbitrary capital controls by governments. Why? Because it's the dollar. But there is Bitcoin, which is free from arbitrary capital controls by governments. So the dream of these liberals was realized in 2008. It doesn't really work. Back in 1943, bankers pressured White to add this to the IMF's mission to deal inter alia with restraints on international trade, such as tariffs, quotas, import controls, and to deal with restrictions on international payments and transfers. About 4 years ago, I met someone obsessed with conspiracy theories, and we talked about Bitcoin. Since I knew this stuff, I asked, as for Bitcoin, honestly, conspiracy theorists will realize this eventually. If conspiracy theorists want to be philosophically consistent, what they should be saying is that Bitcoin was created by the Rothschilds. Bitcoin is actually a conspiracy of the international financial regime. So if you're a conspiracy theorist, you should be buying Bitcoin. But this guy, when I asked him in those conspiracy theory circles where they talk about things like the Freemasons, so did those guys create Bitcoin, or was it made by the other side? He said he doesn't know either. So I laughed and said, if it turns out that Bitcoin gets stronger, you'll just say that's part of the conspiracy too. If you're going to push conspiracy theories, at least learn the roots. The international financial regime champions liberal democracy, whether sincerely or not. They argue for a need for money that is free from national level capital controls. That's exactly the design intent of Bitcoin. So here's the dynamic. On one side, you have industrial capitalists, entrepreneurs. Their interests clash with those of financial capitalists. You may have noticed, industrial capitalists are not liberals. Infancy, especially in developing industries, when they're in their infancy, industrial capitalists are protectionists in every country. Samsung, Hyundai, in the past they were all protectionists. Maybe they still are. They don't talk much about freedom. Why? Because they grew thanks to government protection. If, when Samsung was still young, Japanese products had flooded into Korea without tariffs, would Samsung be what it is now? That's a question worth asking. It's worth reflecting on. That's why industrial capitalists like capital controls. So they generally supported Keynes's ideas. Not always, of course, it depends on their position. Positions change. But no matter the country, those who lend money, loan sharks, financiers, they hate capital controls. The ones big enough to participate in the global regime are the ones who most strongly advocate liberalism. So in conspiracy theories, neoliberalism is seen as the puppet of global finance. Bank of England officials who wanted to protect the pound bloc also supported capital controls. Anyway, that's just an example. British central bankers were different from financiers, different from American financial elites. Anyway, there were these conflicts and compromises. Industrial and financial capitalists had different positions, and Keynes and Dexter White unintentionally sided with the industrial capitalists. They weren't originally trying to take the side of industrial capitalists. The intention was to strengthen the individual power of governments, of individual nation states, because Dexter White and American elites envisioned a post-imperial world order. So what does a post-imperial world order mean? It's a global order without a world government. But is that even possible? Historically, no world order just meant chaos. Like the Mediterranean after Rome, just conflict. So how could a world order work without a world government? Each people forms their own nation state, and those nation states cooperate on agendas, and you create international organizations to mediate that cooperation. That's the answer you all know, right? Do you think that's how the world works? But it doesn't. That was their dream. And surprisingly, it's actually a really convincing dream. Let's look at it from this perspective. At its core, it's still imperialism. The powerful are the ones who rule. It's the powerful who rule, but they dress it up. They do it with genuine conviction. And some of the people who created it truly believed in it, among the very people who built it. I think America's elites are sincere in that way. But from a step back, from a meta perspective, it's still just dressed up. What kind of packaging? Let me give you a quick history of Tibet. KBS, there was even a KBS documentary on it. It's called Tea Road. It was powerful enough that I went and looked up the book too. Tibet came under Chinese control during the Yuan and Qing dynasties. Tibet was such a strong people that it didn't bow to Han-centered states. But when nomads unified China, Tibet had to submit. Why? Because Tibet is huge. In Tibet, if you leave horses to roam, they breed and multiply on their own. Why didn't they bow to the Han? Because the Han are farmers. Tibetans grow up riding horses. They ride really well. It was probably ponies they were good at riding. So when they fought the Han lost again and again. But the Yuan and Qing, they were riders too. That's why Tibet couldn't beat them. But even the Yuan and Qing ruling vast China, found it too inconvenient to directly govern Tibet in the remote highlands. So how did they do it? What was their method? By granting a lot of autonomy. Maybe that was a Yuan and Qing thing, or maybe it was always that way. But it was a very pre-modern system. Basically, religion and the elite class were one and the same. The monks were the elites. So it's a strange kind of Buddhism. It was Lamist Buddhism, and they were granted real power. These monks just studied all day, but they held licenses, real authority. So what kind of licenses? They had the license to import Chinese tea. Tea, not car, but actual tea. In Korean, car and tea are homonyms. Why? Because in the highlands, there's always a vitamin C deficiency. Without vitamin C, you get all sorts of diseases like scurvy. Note, beriberi is caused by vitamin B deficiency. But tea is rich in vitamin C. You might say, why not just eat vegetables? Well, veggies don't grow well there and they spoil fast. But tea is dried and transported, so it's a great source of vitamin C. So they gave monks the exclusive right to import tea. But monks are supposed to stay in temples and meditate. They couldn't do the long-distance trade themselves, so they delegated that right to merchant caravans. It was these pony-riding merchants who actually did the trading. This kind of indirect rule works universally well. When ruling a people, you recognize their native rulers and give them privileges. The best way to maintain an empire is to rule it indirectly. The worst method is replacing the ruling class and governing directly. Direct rule can actually improve the welfare of the people quite a bit. But the ones who benefit from it aren't organized, while the ones who lost power are extremely organized. That's why you can't stop nationalist uprisings. But if you delegate authority to the native rulers, nationalism stays quiet. The Qing dynasty made Korea's king bow and humiliate himself. But they didn't remove him. But Japan did. That's why you don't feel much emotional hostility toward Qing rule. Britain ruled India for 300 years without really changing India's structure. That's how they managed to control such a vast subcontinent with so few officials. Ultimately, the producers are the masses. There is the least resistance when it's the current elites that collect rent. In other words, coming in as a liberating force gets the most resistance. It's better not to be liberators. Just rule like the Qing did over Korea. They ruled for 250 years. The native ruling structure should be recognized. You should view the post-1945 system from this perspective. I'm not saying I see it this way, but it's a way you could see it. It's still imperialism, but it grants significant authority to local elites and recognize each nation state. That's when you get these phenomena. You need to open your eyes to these phenomena. What kind? Offshore phenomena. Because there are borders, there is offshore. Last time when we talked about Eurodollars and offshore finance, I said offshore finance, and it probably felt a bit abstract. Let's unpack that a bit. What is the concept of offshore in the post-imperial era? This cool-looking guy just wanted to play rock music. BBC must have controlled everything at the time. But to play rock music, he got a ship and set up a broadcasting station then, anchored it in the English Channel and ran his radio station. It was the world's largest offshore radio station, Radio Caroline. Never heard of this before, right? If this were the imperial era, this would have been a joke, just a joke. Why? Because in the imperial era, borders were just geographic lines, and authority didn't fade at the border. But in the nation-state era, borders are sacred. The reason Russia is like a global villain right now is because they crossed a border, right? Before arguing who's right, Russia or Ukraine, in that debate, it's impossible to judge. Everyone's got their own story, their own reasons. But one thing is crystal clear. Who crossed the border? Russia did, bad guys. That's how it goes. In the post-imperial nation-state era, borders are bound to be sacred. There's no other way. So clever people started using borders to their advantage. Oh, there's a border, then we'll run the radio station outside Britain. What happened to that ship? Eventually it got kicked out, ended up in the Swedish Channel, kept broadcasting until it got wrecked and sank. Still, it was an amazing, bold attempt. He didn't do anything weird, just wanted to play rock music, because BBC had a monopoly on radio in the UK. Interesting, right? Ever heard of this kind of story? Have you heard of Flag of Convenience? Back in 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico, or the Deepwater Horizon, you know, the square-shaped oil drilling ship. They even made a movie about it. The rig caught fire and caused a massive oil spill. The company was BP, British Petroleum. It's an oil company that originated in Britain, one of the major global oil corporations. What nationality do you think Deepwater Horizon was? You probably don't know. How would you? If you don't know about flags of convenience. The ship was registered in the Marshall Islands. Anyone here heard of the Marshall Islands? Raise your hand if you could point it out on a map. You can't? Of all the world's ships, Panama has the most. So registering a ship's nationality is called a flag of convenience. Flag of convenience. The ship has nothing to do with the country, but they fly that country's flag. Why? Registering a ship worth billions costs less than 1,000 USD in the Marshall Islands. There are no officials, so there's no inspection. Ships that are traveling international waters need a nationality. So if you think of jurisdiction as something tied to sovereign law, there are over 200. This is a kind of bug in the post-imperial era. We're witnessing a bug that Keynes and US elites built. People are clever. So this place, Marshall Islands, you've probably never even heard of it. But its national income, mostly from these shipping registrations. Hey, we'll register your ship. We'll give your ship a nationality. So the ship involved in the accident was Marshall registered. There are lots of Panamanian ships too, for understandable reasons. The Panama Canal. Look at which countries have the most ships registered. Marshall has a ton, right? You've probably never even heard of the Marshall Islands. Let's think about it this way. Just like the Mediterranean after Rome, there is no order and no regime. Then if you're sailing around, pirates could just snatch you up. If this were that kind of era, things would be different, right? Which country would ships want to register in? Which country's flag would you want to fly? I'm almost 100% sure 99% would be USA, right? How peaceful must the high seas be for ships to sail under the Marshall Islands flag? That's how strange the world we live in is. The very fact that you don't even know the term flag of convenience is a unique characteristic of this era. A ship's nationality is whatever you want it to be. There are countries like the Marshall Islands that survive off those registration fees. If I asked you to point to the Marshall Islands on a map, no one here could do it, right? If pirates attacked ships from weak countries, everyone would register their ships with strong nations. Almost all of them would fly the American flag. That's how absurd our times are. Idealists set up this neat world of nation states, and clever business people just keep finding loopholes. So a smart guy says, I'll play rock and roll radio outside the border. I'm not in Britain, I'm broadcasting from a ship off the coast. Same goes for floating casinos. That's exactly what this is. Casinos are illegal in all US states because of America's Puritan roots, Christian values. The laws aren't federal but state laws. So someone realized, wait, what if we put a casino on the river between states? Then it doesn't fall under any state jurisdiction. They float between state lines, literally. And if one state sends inspectors, they just sail out of range. That's the origin of the casino ship. How sacred must borders be for these kinds of bugs to exist? That's why we have terms like flag of convenience. Remember that, flag of convenience. It sounds strange in Korean, right? You should know fancy terms like this so you can brag to your son later. Hey, do you know what a flag of convenience is? It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that I opened this lecture to help you feel just how unusual the times we're living in really are. Everyone around me has studied economics or business. Lots of legal scholars too, really smart people, but they don't understand Bitcoin. I thought they just didn't get Bitcoin. But the more I talk to them, they either don't read books at all or only read in their narrow field. So they have zero understanding of the post-1945 system. It took me a while to realize that, wow, they really don't know how unique this era is. How did I find out? My first job assigned me to research casinos. So I studied casinos when I was 29. And that's how I discovered all this stuff. So I'm lucky. I was already preparing for Bitcoin back when I was 29. In the gambling industry, people are super aware of stuff like this because it's what they exploit for profit. Why? The legal system we have today is not imperial, but a nation-state system. So if you go outside the rules of the border, anything goes. Offshore. That's why it's offshore. It's called jurisdictional arbitrage. This is called jurisdictional arbitrage in fancy terms. You get the idea, right? We studied how Bretton Woods regulated capital flows, but we also studied eurodollars. And with the rise of eurodollars, capital controls declined. That was the 1960s. Do you understand eurodollars? If someone says the US won't allow Bitcoin, I want to ask them this. Then why did they allow eurodollars? They'll probably ask back, what are eurodollars? Eurodollars are the world's largest pile of money, not managed by the US or the UK. The whole world, including the US, the UK, just let it be. What do you think? Oh, they let it be because it's dollars. No, you ignorant fool, it's not the same dollar. Eurodollars themselves are a product of the nation-state system. It's jurisdictional arbitrage in action. A classic example in finance is the MMF, money market fund. Sounds super legit, right? Money market fund. It sounds like some big institutional product. You hear money market fund, and what do you think? Money market fund? Nothing, right? They just named it whatever. After the Great Depression in the 1930s, nation-states started to heavily regulate finance. In the US, there was something called Regulation Q. No paying interest on demand deposits, zero interest. Those short-term accounts where people can withdraw anytime, yeah, don't pay interest on those. Because in trying to attract those funds, banks started offering high interest rates, which led to overheated competition. And people believed that's what caused the banks to become unstable. Looking into why people used FTX so much, some victims are people I know personally, which is sad, but they used it because the fees were low and on. That's why so many jumped in. Without ever stopping to think, there must be a reason no one else does this. They just believed in something. They didn't realize how special this era is or how wild it is. We need to read the East Mediterranean Trilogy by Nanami Shiono. Default reality, just one step outside, is uncivilized. Everyone grew up so comfortably in the cradle of the nation state, so we take everything for granted. But you could just think about it once. If someone offers something so cheap, there must be a reason. So when banks started competing for demand deposits, they created Regulation Q. No interest on these. The whole point was to stop competition over deposits. Regulation Q is about not competing over short-term deposits, but banks still wanted to do it. So they came up with MMFs. It's a deposit, but they didn't call it a deposit. They thought about how to attract people without calling it a deposit, MMF, and that's how MMFs came about. You can withdraw anytime. But when you deposit, they use that money to buy US Treasury bonds. Since they buy US Treasuries and the US wants to sell them, finance people basically sent the government a love letter. We're not buying just anything, only US Treasuries, and this is a joint fund, and people can cash out anytime. It even pays interest. To the customer, it's basically a deposit. It just doesn't say deposit, it's a money market fund. This is a classic example of jurisdictional arbitrage. It's a product of Regulation Q, MMF. The MMF market became huge. People get clever when you start imposing regulations. The reason I emphasize this is because we already saw signs of this with Libra and stablecoins. It's a pretty naive way of thinking. For example, Japan holds US Treasuries, but now they're nervous and selling it off. China's not buying either. Then the US has to sell its bonds. So this is the conspiracy theory, but. So they crack down on exchanges and push to have stablecoin collateral converted into government bonds. Libra's plan was also US Treasuries, MMFs. It's not a new idea. It's what American bankers used. In simple terms, since it's a deposit that can be liquidated at any time, it's basically a stablecoin backed by US Treasuries. But from the Fed's point of view, it's a nightmare. Why? Because the Fed does open market operations, and since Treasuries aren't liquid, they sell them on the market. When they sell Treasuries, they collect dollars. That reduces M1. To reduce the money supply, they sell government bonds. But what do MMFs or US Treasury-backed stablecoins do? The government issues 10-year bonds to soak up liquidity, saying don't use this cash. But then stablecoins get issued based on those very bonds, and they're called high-performance currencies because they circulate so fast. If these quickly circulating high-performance currencies are released into the market so fast, it's meaningless. You pull out dollars just to re-inject them as stablecoins. That's why MMFs are problematic. You get the general idea, right? Originally, 10-year or 5-year treasuries are supposed to lock up liquidity. But the market is clever, so it releases liquidity. That's how they created demand deposit style MMFs. And stablecoins today, they're the same idea. People think, if we back it with treasuries, maybe the US will let us be. Will they? Sure, it's good for them to sell treasuries. But that's not the only thing to consider. It eliminates one of their tools for controlling the money supply, open market operations. You have to think about this. Oh, I really don't know enough. I shouldn't talk about conspiracies when I know so little. That's all it takes. It's not simple, not at all. Eurodollars, they're a product of Regulation Q. They take dollar deposits in London. Since Regulation Q doesn't apply, they can pay as much interest as they want. That's called jurisdictional arbitrage. With the end of imperialism, each country has its own discretion. So there are policy differences between countries. Then exploiting those differences, products are made. Why is this a problem? There are many issues, like tax hedging and all sorts of things. Here's a news story that just came out today. When you see news like this, you'll understand. Jurisdictions have agreed to exchange information about digital platforms. Jurisdiction. But why use jurisdiction instead of country? Belgium, Cayman Islands, Colombia, Costa Rica, Cyprus, Guernsey, Finland, Iceland, Isle of Man, Jersey, Portugal, Slovenia, South Africa, Spain, UK. If you look closely, the only real countries you know are about the UK, Spain, South Africa, Isle of Man, Jersey. All of these are included. These are all offshore finance hubs. It's like that radio ship I mentioned earlier. When these impressive countries strictly control capital with borders, financial capitalists look for something, like that offshore radio. But if you just float a ship, you'll get caught, so they use their heads. They set up in places with some legal system. Jersey, Guernsey, Man, these are all British Crown dependencies. They settle there and run banks. Why? Because there's no regulation. But now they're under fire, because companies like Google make huge profits from multiple countries. And since there are differences in taxes between countries, they essentially invest by exploiting it. So they can manipulate the books so that the most profit is made, where the corporate tax is lowest. But calling it manipulation is tricky, because there are just too many ways to do it legally. So international organizations got together, like, come on, let's start sharing data. Swiss banks have been pressured for a long time, and now they're constantly coughing up information. These places are signing on now. The UN is watching, and the US might get involved. They're trying to show self-regulation. They're trying to send this sort of message. Let's take Jersey as an example. Jersey is here. Caroline Radio Broadcasting operated in places like this. The English Channel, Jersey. Right above it is Guernsey. They're not British territories. They're owned by the Crown. During the Victorian era, these were havens for European fundamentalists. Fundamentalists in Europe, basically communists. Why did they flee here? Because Britain at the time was pretty tolerant, while Germany and France absolutely weren't. So when they escaped to places like this, as I've said before, whether Germany and France, most of Europe was related to Queen Victoria, like, Auntie, can you send that guy to us so we can execute him? She'd say, well, if he were in England, I could, but they're in Jersey. That's outside my jurisdiction. It's a self-governing place, she'd say. In short, it's a convenient place. China has something similar. Hong Kong. After Bretton Woods, these places became havens for tax evaders. In fact, Jersey was the first to recognize Bitcoin as an asset in 2014. Impressive, right? They recognized it. People who study offshore systems immediately recognize the essence of Bitcoin. Even if the US or China encroach on their business, they know Bitcoin is their last line of defense. They know countries can't touch this. Nay, they gathered deposits from wealthy people around the world, pooled it, and funneled it into London. In a book that covers this, it says that when the City of London people get reports about these issues, they just listen. And they don't say anything. They simply say, we only heard about it. The British government goes out of its way to hide its control over Jersey. They control it, but pretend not to. Same goes for Bermuda, same for the Cayman Islands. Those are over there, in the seas between the US and Brazil. Did the US really dismantle British imperialism? Here's how you answer. The US dismantled the British Empire, but there's one thing it couldn't dismantle: Britain's financial empire. Britain gave up India, Africa, Australia, and so on. But they kept all these tiny islands. Those islands have no value. Their value was realized later. Offshore, oh, we can use them as offshore. They're like radio stations outside our borders. And so Keynes and Dexter White's dream of containing capital within the nation-state system failed. It lasted only 10 or 20 years. By the 1960s, offshore finance, Eurodollars, was booming. You've got to look at it like this. It's a way of looking at the world. The world is a constant push and pull, a balance of forces. To put it another way, when I try to persuade people about Bitcoin, I hit a wall. People don't like tension. They want things to converge, to settle. I see the same pattern in economics too. They're always trying to pinpoint a perfect equilibrium. I'm not qualified to discuss it in depth, but there's a school of thought like mine. The school that says there is no equilibrium. Sure, equilibrium exists, but it's unstable. It's always dynamic. I think that describes the real world better. And our lives too. We live in tension. Until the day we die. I mentioned this last time. Law or grace, which one is it? Doesn't that hit home? When you look at your family, do you let things slide? Yeah, of course you forgive them. What else can you do? But if you keep forgiving endlessly, they start taking advantage, right? It's hard. So with offshore issues, countries like France constantly wrestling with it. There's a country called Monaco, just below France. The Principality of Monaco is closely tied to France, but it's still an independent nation. When researchers randomly called numbers from the Monaco resident directory, 3/4 of the people they reached weren't living in Monaco, they were living in Paris. Why? Because Monaco gives tax breaks. So the Parisian rich just claimed Monaco residency. This photo is from 1962. The French government closed the border to Monaco. Since Monaco is barely a country, closing the border just meant blocking one road. Monaco protested that it is a violation of their sovereignty, and eventually they reached a deal. French people who hadn't lived in Monaco for 5 years had to pay French income tax. That's how it was settled. So some people might say, why not just regulate everywhere like Monaco? That's the worldview of people who think the US or the global financial regime can eliminate Bitcoin. It's a childish and ahistorical worldview. It's a textbook worldview, one that exists only in elementary school textbooks. Like, if governments just do their job, everything will work out. It's not that simple. Why? Let me share one aspect of the truth. If you don't understand this, it's just because you don't know enough yet. There's no debate about it. Money doesn't really exist. Money is just a ledger. If you do a thought experiment, you don't need a single coin. You just need a ledger. That's where the truth lies. When money was controlled, multinational corporations manipulated their ledgers and crossed borders. You can't stop that. So how do they manipulate the book? Let's Google has sales in A, B, C, D, and E, A, B, C, D, E, and in the region with the highest tax rate. They pay engineers salaries. Then expenses are huge there, so they don't owe much tax there. And all the profits show up where tax is lowest. Can you regulate that by shutting borders like they did with Monaco? That worked with income tax because you could catch people. But how do you stop multinational companies moving numbers on a spreadsheet? It's insane. There are lots of proposals. But geopolitically, most of them are nonsense. They sound convincing, but they just don't hold up geopolitically. In their worldview, they assume all countries' interests are aligned. So since all countries are aligned, when a great idea like this comes along, every country will share data and act in unison. That's not how it works. Countries fall into a prisoner's dilemma. Why? Because each country starts thinking, if I relax regulations just a bit, then giants like Google will pay taxes here. Sounds great, right? We need money anyway. If I lower the tax rate a little, Google will pay me taxes. You think some country won't take that deal? Then can't you just punish those countries? That's imperialism. But didn't we all say no to imperialism? So since there's no imperialism, multinational companies keep finding bugs in the system. Bugs in the nation-state model. Same principle. It's the same principle as casino shit. Like that weird guy who just wanted to play rock music. Totally pure motive, almost childlike. He just wanted people to hear rock music. So he bought a ship, sailed it into the English Channel, and ran a whole radio station from there. That's the whole idea. Everything is wrapped up in that one concept. With that model, you can run casinos, finance, you can do anything. Except now it's not a ship, it's an island like Jersey. Now, the so-called globalists in conspiracy theories, the people who advocate a global regime say this. Then let's do this. Let's stop having different ledgers for each country. Let's standardize accounting and collect tax from Google centrally, and then distribute it. And that will do it. So the US collects Google's taxes, then gives some to Japan, Korea, and so on. That's the world government we dream of. Those who advocate it are all imperialists. They don't say it, but they want imperialism. Because imperialism isn't always bad. We need to think about the characteristics of this era. Joint collection and distribution. How cool is that? That's imperialism. The problem with people who only study economics is that they don't even have the concept of a nation state in their heads. They ignore it and they only see individuals. They're advocating something without even knowing what it is. Libertarians ironically support the strongest world government. In the end, their road leads right back to imperialism. It's terrible. That's what happens. That's how the logic goes. Can nation states maintain this kind of cooperation? No. We don't even have to see it. History shows it. Because they couldn't do it. That's exactly why Eurodollars became so huge. Because countries couldn't reach agreement because of the prisoner's dilemma. And Eurodollars filled that gap like crazy. They couldn't even stop Eurodollars. How on earth will they stop Bitcoin? So when people say Bitcoin can be stopped, it probably can't be stopped, right? Even that is not okay. You'd have to change the whole world regime to imperialism. International financial elites have blocked cooperation among nation states. In 1979, Volcker's policy to restore the dollar was meant to prevent IMF international hot money, short-term capital, like what caused Korea's IMF crisis, from interfering with inflows and outflows. So they tried to apply reserve requirements to euro dollars simultaneously. It would have to be simultaneous, right? If one country goes easy, the money just moves there, so you need a joint effort. If only the US does it, only they'll just lose their deposits. But the Bank of England and Swiss National Bank opposed it, and at the Basel meeting in the 1980s, it was overwhelmingly rejected. These people here. Who are they? They're the heads of central banks. That's what the Basel meeting is. In 1979, they also succeeded in rejecting the Euro Currency Market Control Act. No wonder there are conspiracy theories. There are unelected power groups in the world, and the international financial regime is one of them. Because of challenges from non-bank companies, they wanted to protect their offshore business. What does that mean? Banks have always faced challenges. Banking is fundamentally a licensing business. Why are bank runs possible? Because banks have a unique license. They can use customers' money. That's the bank's license. It's always been possible, but you can do it without a license if the market trusts you. FTX broke that trust. They did it without saying that they were going to do it. Banks have always done that. But it became a license, but non-banks have grown huge since the 1960s. It started with insurance companies, and now companies' deposits are massive. For example, even car companies can be considered financial institutions. Who pays full cash for a car these days? In my case, I leased it and later traded it in. That's how people buy things like this. Basically, without giving money, you're buying debt. So car companies with good credit borrow Eurodollars. Because car companies have good credit, they borrow Eurodollars. And since Eurodollars can be rolled over daily, it's not a problem. The interest rate is only about 3% annually. So the car company borrows Eurodollars at 3%, then lends to its customers at 4% through auto loans or leases. They make a 1% profit just sitting there. This kind of non-financial company banking is everywhere. Isn't that banking? You look at it and go, wait, that's banking. They're sourcing money at super low interest, using their credit as collateral and lending it to customers they already know well. They even hold collateral. What happens if you don't pay? They just repossess the car. With companies like this growing, banks are being challenged. If a car company works through a bank, it's not really banking. But if they do it themselves, that's banking. Go look it up right now. Starbucks has a massive deposit balance, your reloaded balances. Starbucks, where you get your coffee, right? It's just a coffee shop. But their deposits rival some US community banks. They're about the size of a couple small banks. These challenges to banks, they've been around a long time. Banks are losing ground. That's why banks have history. There are banking dynasties, top elites, aristocrats. As the aristocrats of finance, what they're really capable of is moving massive foundational sums of money through shared solidarity. But doing that requires going beyond the boundaries of the nation state. They have a vested interest in creating regimes that operate independently of national government. And today, that tendency is only growing stronger. Ask yourself, do you think Kakao will take over Worry Bank or the other way around? Actually, not even Kakao. Upbit tried to take over Worry Bank, right? When we talk about banks today, well, Korean banks are an exception. That's because our banks don't have historical roots. They weren't founded by old banking dynasties. Traditionally, in conspiracy theories, there's talk of powerful banking families, the kind that gather in places like Switzerland. These people control massive institutions, but when they're hit with regulations, they can be broken up. Right now, those very players are keeping their distance from Bitcoin. They're keeping their distance, but I think it's just a matter of time. They'll eventually treat Bitcoin as one of their strategic options because they'll realize it's the way to fend off challenges from Apple, Google, and Kakao. They'll realize Bitcoin is their only move. If we give even this up to them, then there's truly nothing left for us. I believe that day will come. So even if we don't love Bitcoin's price right now, if we have cash and a steady income, we should buy now. If you could borrow Eurodollars, that'd be ideal. But since you probably can't, don't buy it on debt. Can't you see the trend? As each country keeps creating tax and multinational issues, this mood shifted with the 2008 financial crisis. People started saying, let's regulate Eurodollars, let's destroy all offshore finance. Yeah, that's the mood. They started by destroying places people understand, like Switzerland, and now those places are shaking. That's why the UK is taking a different tone on Bitcoin from the US. They think offshore dollars won't last long. This is our empire. Then at least we should do Bitcoin. That's what happens. The people at this table are the ones in the financial regime, one of the global regimes. This financial regime is very important. They set the base rates for everything, from student loans on up. The day they open their eyes to Bitcoin is coming soon. That's my argument. That's it for today. See you next time.